I found my mother's will in a shoebox under her bed 3 days after the funeral. The amount it listed, $340,000 in savings bonds and a paid-off house in Knoxville, should have been the beginning of something. Instead, it was the beginning of the worst 4 months of my life. My name is Loretta Haynes. I was 44 years old when my mother died, working as a medical billing specialist at a regional hospital outside Nashville, Tennessee, pulling in a salary that covered my rent and not much else. I had been divorced for 8 years, raised my daughter Chloe on my own from the time she was 11, and spent most of my adult life doing the practical, unglamorous work of staying afloat. My mother, Dottie Haynes, had spent 30 years quietly saving, clipping coupons, reusing grocery bags, refusing to turn the heat above 68 degrees in January. She never told me how much she had accumulated. That was not a thing women of her generation discussed openly, even with their daughters. I was her only living child. My brother Kevin had died in 2009, a car accident on I-40 in the rain, and after that it had always been just the two of us. My mother and I talked on the phone every Sunday night without fail, and I drove the 2.5 hours to Knoxville to see her at least once a month, more often in her final year when her heart had started giving her trouble. When she passed on, a quiet Tuesday in October, it was me who sat with her, me who called the funeral home, me who stood at the graveside and thanked the people who came and meant it. The shoebox was her filing system. I recognized it immediately, a faded blue naturalizer box she had used for important papers since before I could remember. Inside was the will, handwritten on a legal pad and notarized at her bank branch in 2017, along with a list of the savings bonds, the deed to her house on Linden Street, and a small envelope labeled simply Loretta in her rounded, careful handwriting. Inside the envelope was a note that said, "I want you to have all of it. You showed up. That means everything." I sat on the floor of her bedroom for a long time after reading that. Then I photographed every document in the shoebox, the same practical instinct that made me good at my job, kicking in even through the grief, and I called Chloe, who was 22 and living in Chattanooga. Chloe listened the same way she always had, quietly and completely, before she said anything. Then she said, "Mom, you need to get a probate attorney before you do anything else. Don't talk to anyone at the bank without one." I almost told her she was being overly cautious. I'm glad I didn't. I found Terrence Okafor through a referral from a colleague at the hospital who had used him for her own mother's estate 2 years earlier. His office was on the 2nd floor of a building downtown, small and efficient, with the kind of diplomas on the wall that suggested he worked more cases than he advertised. He reviewed the will and the list of assets in our first meeting and told me the estate was straightforward enough to move through probate without much difficulty. He seemed calm about it in a way I found reassuring. What he said next, I was less prepared for. "Do you know if your mother worked with a financial advisor at any point? Someone outside the bank?" I told him I didn't think so. My mother didn't trust financial advisors. She thought they took your money and talked over your head about it. Terrence nodded slowly. "The reason I ask is that 2 of these savings bonds are registered with a co-ownership designation I wasn't expecting to see. Your name is listed as primary, but there's a secondary name here, someone named Boyd Whitaker." I did not recognize that name at all. Terrence asked me to think carefully. Did my mother ever mention a Boyd Whitaker? A friend, a neighbor, someone from her church. I told him I had never heard that name in my life. He was quiet for a moment in that particular way. Attorneys go quiet when they have more to say than they want to say too quickly. I'd like to make some inquiries before we proceed. It's probably a clerical error. These things happen more often than people assume. But I want to verify before we make any moves with the estate." I drove home from that meeting with the particular discomfort of someone who has just been told there might be a problem, but not what kind. My mother had been careful with money her entire life. She had not been the kind of person who made clerical errors. She kept carbon copies of everything. Terence called me 4 days later. His voice was more measured than it had been at our first meeting, which I was already learning to read as a signal. Boyd Whitaker, it turned out, was a man who had attended the same church as my mother for the past 6 years. He had served on the finance committee there. He was 71 years old, recently retired from a career in insurance, and according to Terence's preliminary research, he had a pattern, documented in a complaint filed with the Tennessee Department of Commerce and Insurance in 2019, of developing close relationships with elderly widows in financial advisory capacities and appearing as a co-designee on their accounts. The 2019 complaint was filed by the daughter of a woman named Edna Coulter, Terence said. It was investigated and closed without formal action because Mrs. Coulter declined to cooperate. She was E3 and apparently did not want the conflict. "What exactly are we saying here?" I asked. "I'm saying that someone your mother trusted from her church community appears to have positioned himself as a secondary owner on at least 2 of her savings bonds, likely sometime in the past 2 or 3 years. I don't know yet whether your mother understood what she was signing when she did it. I don't know whether she was told it was a beneficiary designation rather than a co-ownership, which is a common confusion. What I do know is that if she had died without a will, or if the will were successfully challenged, those bonds would transfer directly to Boyd Whitaker without passing through the estate." I sat with that for a long moment. The numbers were running in my head without my permission. 2 of the bonds listed were for $45,000 each, $90,000 that someone from my mother's church had quietly attached his name to. "Can he claim them now?" I asked. "He could try," Terence said. "With a valid co-ownership designation, he has a legal argument, at least on the surface. Whether that argument holds against a contested probate proceeding is a different question." I think it's worth finding out more about Mr. Whitaker before we make any decisions about how to proceed. The thing no one tells you about grief is how it turns practical matters into something physically exhausting. I had spent 3 weeks organizing my mother's house, sorting her clothes, calling her friends, writing thank you notes for flowers I couldn't remember receiving. And now I had to find the energy to think about Boyd Whitaker. I started the way I start everything, carefully. I found Boyd's name in the church directory my mother kept in her kitchen drawer. He had a listed phone number, a home address, and a committee role, pastoral finance advisor, whatever that meant. I did not call him. I had promised Terence I wouldn't contact anyone connected to the estate without clearing it first. What I did instead was talk to my mother's neighbor, Paulette Givens, who had lived 2 doors down on Linden Street for 20 years and who knew everything about everyone on that block with the particular expertise of someone who had never once been too busy to notice. Paulette told me over coffee at her kitchen table that Boyd had started coming around about 3 years ago, first with the church's food pantry outreach, then more regularly, sometimes dropping off casseroles, once helping my mother with her taxes. "I thought he was just being neighborly," Paulette said. "Your mom seemed to trust him." She called him her financial guardian angel. She paused over her mug. I didn't love the sound of that, but she was happy, and it wasn't my business. Did she ever mention signing anything with him? Any documents? Paulette thought for a long moment. She mentioned going to the bank with him once. She said he helped her reorganize things to make sure they'd be easier to pass along. I thought she meant putting your name on things. She had, just not exclusively. Terrence filed a formal objection to the co-ownership designations as part of the probate proceeding, citing undue influence and requesting a full accounting of any transactions involving Boyd Whitaker and my mother's accounts over the past 4 years. The probate court issued a temporary freeze on the bonds in question, which meant neither of us could access them until the matter was resolved. The freeze was, Terrence told me, exactly the outcome we wanted. Official recognition that something was wrong, with the assets protected while the process played out. What I had not anticipated was how quickly Boyd Whitaker would find out about it. He called me on a Thursday evening. I didn't recognize the number, but something made me answer. Loretta. He said my name like he knew me, like we'd met. I think there's been some misunderstanding about Dottie's accounts, and I'd like to clear it up before the lawyers make things more complicated than they need to be. His voice was warm. That was the thing I remembered most afterward. The practiced warmth of someone who had learned that warmth was the best tool for the job. Mr. Whitaker, I said, I'm not able to discuss the estate with you directly. You'd need to contact my attorney. Loretta, I understand you're hurting. Losing your mother is one of the hardest things a person goes through. The last thing I want is for her memory to be tied up in some legal dispute. Your mother wanted... Please don't tell me what my mother wanted, I said. Contact Terrence Okafor's office. I hung up. My hands were not shaking, which surprised me. What I felt instead was something colder and cleaner, a kind of clarity that comes when you realize the thing you were afraid of has finally just shown itself to you directly. I called Terrence that same evening and relayed the conversation. He asked me to write it down immediately and said he'd be flagging it to the court as potential witness tampering, given the active probate freeze. He also asked whether Boyd had approached me anywhere else, in person, by email, through anyone I knew. Not yet, I told him. 3 days later, a woman I didn't know called my cell phone from a number I didn't recognize. She identified herself as a friend from Dottie's Bible study group. She wanted me to know what a wonderful man Boyd was, how much comfort he had given my mother in her final years, how he had sat with her through 2 hospitalizations and organized meals through the church when my mother couldn't cook for herself. She spoke quickly, with the slightly rehearsed quality of someone reading from bullet points in their head. I thanked her for calling. I told her I was sure her intentions were kind, and I told her that any concerns about the estate needed to go through my attorney. She sounded faintly surprised that her call hadn't accomplished more. I told Terrence about that one too. What I had not expected to find was that my mother had kept records of everything. That was exactly who she was, and I had simply never had reason to go looking before. In the second drawer of her desk, the one with the hanging files she'd organized alphabetically in the 1990s and never rearranged, I found a folder labeled simply Boyd in her handwriting. Inside, it was a copy of a form from her bank, a change of designation form for 2 savings bonds dated 19 months earlier. My mother's signature was on it. Boyd's name had been added in a different pen, in handwriting that was not my mother's. I sat there for a long time with that folder open in my lap. Then I photographed every page, emailed it to Terrence, and called Chloe. She drove up from Chattanooga that weekend, which I had not asked her to do. but which felt like exactly the right thing once when she was there. We went through the rest of the desk together. In the back of the same drawer, I found a letter my mother had apparently drafted but never sent, undated, written in pencil on a yellow legal pad. It was addressed to her pastor. It said that she had become confused about some paperwork Boyd had brought her and that she wanted to talk to someone about it before she did anything else. The letter stopped mid-paragraph, trailing off in a way that suggested she had put it down intending to come back to it. She never had. I gave the letter to Terrence the following Monday. He was quiet on the other end of the phone for a moment after I described it. Then he said it was the most important document in the entire case. The investigation moved quickly after that. Terrence submitted the letter and the original form to a forensic document examiner, who determined that the ink used for Boyd's name and the ink used for my mother's signature were of different ages, consistent with the form having been signed by my mother at one point and Boyd's name added later. The examiner also noted that the handwriting adding Boyd's designation did not match my mother's in either style or pressure pattern. When the probate court received the examiner's report, the judge issued an emergency motion removing Boyd Whitaker's co-ownership claim from both bonds pending a full hearing. A copy was sent to the Tennessee Department of Commerce and Insurance. Where it landed, Terrence later told me, on the desk of the same investigator who had handled the closed complaint about Edna Coulter in 2019. That investigator called Terrence directly. Boyd Whitaker, it turned out, had not stopped at my mother and Edna Coulter. The investigator's office had quietly been tracking a pattern of complaints, none large enough individually to have moved to prosecution, spanning 11 years, and at least 7 elderly women in 3 counties, all of them widows, all of them active in their church communities, all of them with assets that had quietly gained a secondary name at some point after Boyd became a trusted presence in their lives. The total amount across all cases was just under $600,000. I remember sitting in Terrence's office when he told me that number and feeling something shift in my chest. Not shock exactly, more like the terrible clarity of a thing finally making sense. The way a bruise looks worse once you understand what made it. What happens now? I asked. The Department of Commerce and Insurance is referring the full pattern to the district attorney's office, Terrence said. Your case, because it has the clearest documentary evidence, particularly the draft letter, and the forensic report on the bond form, is likely to be the centerpiece. The DA's office will want to speak with you. He paused. Your mother's bonds will be released from freeze and returned to the estate in full once the hearing concludes. Given the examiner's findings, I don't expect the hearing to be contested. What about the other women? I asked. The ones before my mother. That, he said carefully, is going to be complicated. Several of them have died. Several others are in their late 80s and may not be able to participate in proceedings, whether their families were ever notified that anything irregular happened. That's something the investigators are now trying to determine. I thought about my mother's unfinished letter, the mid-paragraph trail off in pencil on yellow paper. The question she had decided to bring to her pastor instead of a lawyer, and the fact that she had never quite gotten there. I want to cooperate with the DA, I said. Whatever they need. Boyd was charged 8 weeks later. 18 counts of financial elder abuse across 7 cases, plus fraud and forgery charges specific to my mother's bond designations. A separate civil action was filed by two families who had retained their own attorneys after the investigation became public through court filings. The preliminary hearing was held in Knox County on a gray February morning. I came with Chloe, who had taken a day off work without my asking. Terrence sat beside me in the gallery. Paulette Givens had asked if she could come, and I had told her yes, not entirely sure why it mattered to me, only knowing that it did. Boyd Whitaker in person was smaller than I had imagined him. That is almost always true of the people who frighten you most. In person, they are mostly people, mortal and visibly worried, and not nearly as large as the space they occupied in your mind. He wore a blue blazer that looked slightly too formal for the setting, which reminded me somehow of someone who had always depended on first impressions. He did not look at me when I came in. I sat anyway, and I let myself look at him as long as I needed to. My testimony was straightforward. I described finding the shoebox, noticing the co-designation, discovering the bank form and the draft letter, and relaying Boyd's phone call to me verbatim as best I could remember it. His attorney, a careful, older man named Sherman Pratt, asked whether my mother had ever expressed confusion about her finances generally, whether she sometimes forgot things. My mother kept alphabetical files in her desk from 1991 through the year she died, I said. She tracked every bond she had ever purchased in a handwritten ledger that goes back 30 years. She forgot things the way most people her age forgot things. She did not forget her finances. Sherman Pratt did not press further on that point. The forensic examiner's testimony was methodical and detailed. The document, the original bond form, told its own story clearly enough that I watched several people in the courtroom write things down while he was speaking, which felt significant in a way I could not entirely articulate. The most important moment came, as important moments often do, in a part of the proceeding I hadn't been told to prepare for. A financial investigator from the state's Department of Commerce took the stand and walked through the 11-year timeline across all 7 women. 7 names, 7 church communities, 7 instances of a man offering help with paperwork, guidance on accounts, practical kindness during vulnerable seasons of life, and quietly leaving his name on things as he went. The courtroom was very still during that testimony. Boyd's composure, which had held through most of the morning in a posture of dignified puzzlement, finally cracked when the investigator reached the 6th name on the list, a woman named Agnes Pursley of Maryville, Tennessee, who had died in 2021 without her family ever knowing what had been done to her account. I watched Boyd lean toward Sherman Pratt and say something quiet and urgent, and I watched Sherman Pratt's expression shift from careful professional neutrality into something considerably more complicated. The judge called a recess. It lasted nearly 2 hours. When the proceeding resumed, Sherman Pratt informed the court that his client wished to enter a plea on the charges pertaining to my mother's case and the 3 cases with living victims who were prepared to cooperate. He was not, he said, in a position to speak to the remaining charges at this time, pending further discussions with his client. The judge looked at Boyd Whitaker directly. She noted for the record that the evidence before the court suggested a pattern of conduct spanning more than a decade and affecting a significant number of individuals who were by definition among the most vulnerable members of their communities. She ordered a full presentence investigation covering all 11 years. She also directed her clerk to contact the probate courts in the other counties where victims had been identified to determine whether any secondary estate proceedings should be reopened. Boyd did not speak during any of this. He sat very still, with his hands folded on the table in front of him, which was perhaps the most honest thing I had seen him do. The bonds were released to my mother's estate the following week. Terence walked me through the final distribution documents with the same brisk efficiency he had shown from our first meeting. $90,000 that had briefly had someone else's name on them was now passing through probate the way my mother had always intended. Quietly, carefully, and to me. I didn't feel triumphant about it. I want to be honest about that. What I mostly felt was tired in a particular way that had nothing to do with sleep. The kind of tired that comes from spending 4 months in a situation you did not choose, maintaining a clarity you had to actively defend every single day, when what you actually needed was just to grieve. Chloe took me to dinner the night the bonds cleared, a quiet Italian place in the Marble Springs neighborhood of Knoxville that my mother used to love. We sat at a table near the window and ordered things she would have ordered, and did not talk about Boyd or probate or forensic examiners for the entire meal. Chloe asked me about my mother's garden, which she missed. I told her I was going to plant sweet peas in the spring, even though I didn't have a green thumb, because my mother had grown them along the back fence every year for as long as I could remember. Chloe reached across the table and held my hand for a moment. She didn't say anything. I didn't need her to. Under the terms of his plea, Boyd Whitaker received a sentence of 4 years with restitution ordered across all cases where the amounts could be documented and the original victims or their estates could be located. His right to serve in any financial advisory capacity, formal or informal, was permanently revoked. The charges connected to Agnes Pursley's estate and the 2 other deceased victims were referred for separate proceedings in their respective counties. 3 of the 7 families affected received some form of financial restitution. The others, those where the money had already moved, where the victims had died years ago and the paper trail was incomplete, had less clear outcomes. The investigator told me, when I asked directly, that this was more common than it should be, that cases like Boyd's were rarely discovered until someone with documentation appeared, that most of the time the person who noticed something wrong was the first family member willing to push back, in a situation where pushing back was much easier not to do. I thought about my mother's unfinished letter, the fact that she had started to push back in her own way with a pencil and a yellow legal pad and had not quite made it to the end of the paragraph. I put sweet peas in along her back fence that April. They came in well, which surprised me. Chloe drove up the first weekend they bloomed, and we stood in the backyard for a while just looking at them, neither of us talking much. I have thought sometimes in the months since about what would have happened if I had not been the kind of person who photographs documents. If I had gone to the bank on my own in the weeks after the funeral, grief-fogged and moving fast through a checklist, and simply accepted whatever a teller told me. If I had trusted that my mother's careful life had produced a clean and simple outcome and not gone looking in the second drawer of the desk, Boyd Whitaker had spent 11 years counting on exactly that. On the grief fog and the deference and the assumption that a man from your mother's church who had brought her casseroles and held her hand in the hospital must have meant well. He had built an entire system on the reasonable human reluctance to look closely at the people who had offered kindness during the hardest moments of your life. My mother had looked. Partway, she had started the letter and put down the pencil, maybe intending to finish it on a day when she felt more certain, a day that did not come in time. I finished it for her. That is the only way I know how to describe what I did across those 4 months. Not as a legal battle, or a fraud investigation, or a successful probate proceeding. Just as finishing the letter my mother had started. Making sure that what she had spent a lifetime carefully accumulating went exactly where she had always meant for it to go. And making sure that Boyd Whitaker would not be able to sit in another woman's living room, warm and helpful and slightly too good at paperwork, and do it all again to someone else's mother. That woman he defrauded in Maryville, Agnes Pursley, her daughter contacted me through Terrence 6 months after the sentencing. She had found out about the case through local news coverage and tracked down our names through the court filings. We talked on the phone for nearly an hour. She told me her mother had mentioned a Boyd at some point, described him as a helpful man from someone's church. But her mother had been private about finances in the way that generation often was, and she had never thought to ask more. She did not ask me for anything in that phone call. She just wanted to say thank you. She said it the way people say things they have been sitting with for a while, carefully, like they want to be sure they get it right. I told her I was sorry it had happened to her mother. I told her I was glad she knew. We still exchange messages sometimes. Small things mostly. Last spring she told me her own garden was coming in, and sent me a photo of some tomatoes she was proud of. I sent her back a picture of my mother's sweet peas. I did not know Agnes Pursley. I never would. But I know her daughter now, and I think my mother would have liked that. She believed the connections you find in the worst moments of your life are sometimes the ones that turn out to matter most. She used to tell me that when I was young and stubborn and refused to ask for help from people I didn't know yet, I didn't fully understand what she meant until I was 44 years old, sitting on the floor of her bedroom with a blue shoebox in my lap and a decision to make about how carefully I was going to pay attention. Document everything. Question the name you don't recognize. And never let grief move faster than your own good sense, because the people who depend on that grief moving fast are counting on you to let it.